So
Look at you.
a little challenging, but it's okay. I will go, let me see. I will do the introduction, but I think I will wait a little bit for attendees to come.
Sure. I saw that Zoltan had done one somewhat recently as well, right?
Yeah, we have different, again, it's a huge discussion, but we have ibpsa research committee, educational committee, and every one of us have different webinars that we organize. So this
Okay.
is like part of research committee webinar.
Nice. Yeah, that will be helpful. I didn't provide too much background on all of the City Learn stuff. I have enough to provide
No,
some context, but
that's
yeah.
totally okay.
Yeah. No, it's
Yeah,
helpful already that he kind of did one of the webinars in case I think a lot of people have maybe seen or are familiar with his work and some of the stuff related. So that's
yeah,
helpful.
yeah. Yeah, most of the people who are watching this webinar or joining it is
Yeah.
like from very like building simulation area. So they
Yeah.
do have they understand like who's related to like who and in what like power concept. So okay,
Exactly.
cool. If we're good, Catherine, I will start like doing the introduction and then
Great.
introduce you, and then you can start. I'll do stage is yours. Welcome everyone. Today's webinar is Effects of Occupant Thermostat Override Behavior on Residential Demand Response, presented by Catherine Casper. My name is Aisha Demir, and I will be moderating today's webinar. So the session will be recorded. We have a couple of housekeeping items that I will tell you before Catherine starts. The session will be recorded and available on ibpsa-usa's YouTube channel. You will be muted and off camera during this session, so we don't really allow you guys to stop and ask questions, but you're welcome to put your questions and thoughts and ideas in chat if you want them to be read out loud and answered at the end. If you want to ask your question at the end of session, please go ahead and raise your hand. We will try to give you that right to ask. I mean, not right, but like asking Catherine face to face. At the end of the 40-minute presentation, I will unmute our audience on Zoom for the discussion. And Catherine Casper is a PhD candidate of building engineering in the Department of Building Civil and Environmental Engineering at Concordia University, co-supervised by Dr. Mohamed Auf and Dr. Ursula Eichker, I don't know how to pronounce the
Hiker.
last name. Eicher. Good. Thank you,
Yeah.
Catherine. She obtained her bachelor in civil engineering from McGill University before working on sustainable earthquake reconstruction projects in Nepal between 2015 and 16. Upon returning to North America, she obtained her master's in civil engineering from the University of New Hampshire while working in energy planning and policy at the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her research is focused on using multi-agent reinforced learning for energy management at the neighborhood level with the principal goal of balancing energy savings and occupant needs and comforts. So stage is yours. I'll stop sharing my screen, Catherine, and I will go back to it after. So I will end my sharing and you should be able to share your screen.
Thank you, Aisha. Replace current share. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, I think it's Control L, Control N, Control H. Oh no. View, Control L. I was close. Okay, can you see everything now? Just maybe minimize this. All good, Aisha? You can see everything?
We're good. Yes, go ahead.
Okay,
Thank you.
perfect. Great, thank you for that intro. That was so nice. Yeah, as Aisha mentioned, my name is Catherine Casper. I'm a PhD candidate at Concordia University in Montreal. Today I'm going to be presenting on a paper that we published about a year ago that's called The Effects of Occupant Thermostat Override Behavior on Residential Demand Response. These are the co-authors for that paper. I'll talk a little bit about kind of everyone's components a little bit later, but the QR code here is a link to the full paper, and I'll mention it again later at the end of the presentation. Okay. Okay, great. So as I mentioned, I'm in Montreal. I want to give a little bit of energy context here specifically. So here in Quebec, about 95% of our electricity generation comes from hydropower. So what this means in terms of our local government and our goals for decarbonization is really that electrification is seen as our main key focus for decarbonization. We also have about 54% of our annual residential electricity consumption that's coming from space heating. We have long winters here. And then about more than half of our residential buildings in Canada are single family homes, even higher percentage in the US. And the idea here is that residential buildings together are responsible for a lot of electricity consumption, but each individual building doesn't necessarily have the biggest impact. However, when we think about residential buildings and being able to scale up and really collect them together to create energy flexibility potential, there's definitely a lot of opportunity there, looking on a scale of, let's say, 20 to like 100 buildings or even more. So our local utility provider, Hydro-Quebec, has really identified one of our key needs for flexibility, which is really shifting electricity away from these two peak periods. So what we see is from 6 to 9 a.m. and 4 to 8 p.m. in winter. We have these two peak periods, and this is generally when people are at home, when they're using appliances, and also when heating demands are higher. So the key question becomes, how can we manage this increasing electricity demand? The two of the key solutions provided by Hydro-Quebec, our utility provider, one being the transition to diversified distributed smart grids. So as more and more houses have EVs or battery storage, how can we look at things like bidirectional flow and managing these types of loads to create some flexibility? And secondly, demand response programs. So what we're seeing is more and more smart appliances being integrated within homes. And thermostat set points specifically represent a really big opportunity for demand response. So here in Quebec, actually, we have a very new program within the last 5 years or so. It's called High-Low, and it's a demand response program in which the occupants of a building can receive a free smart thermostat in exchange for participation in the direct load control, DLC, of their thermostats during specific demand response times in winter. Every year, this program is only 5 years old, and every year there's kind of an evolution of how we formulate this program. But the most recent one had it so that the occupants can choose their setback, meaning a reduction to the set point, and either choose extreme, bold, or moderate during the demand response event, the upcoming one. And the occupants have the ability to override their set point at any time. So this program is super interesting, but with it comes some key challenges that we're looking to overcome. One being that the occupant override uncertainties make our demand response outcomes a little bit more unpredictable. The second one being that thermal discomfort can discourage continued participation. So if they're really unhappy with the way that the demand response program is being implemented, they're not likely to keep subscribing. And then the third one being that limited financial incentives may not sustain engagement. So let's say we have someone who is willing to participate in these events, and then at the end of the month, they don't really see any benefits for participation. This could affect participation in the long run. So what we want to do is really just to better predict and improve our demand response performance. We think that the occupant set point preferences and override behaviors can be characterized better and can be integrated into the direct load control so that we can better, improve these algorithms in these programs. So I just wanted to cover some of the basic tools that are used for the control of building energy systems, whether it be in simulation or in the real world. With rule-based control, this is typically what we see in most houses or even institutional buildings, whereby we have a set of rules that our HVAC system or our batteries are following. It's very easy to understand and implement, as you all know, like low computational demand, stable, but it's not really adaptable. We're maybe not harnessing things like occupancy in the way that we could, so we can definitely get better performance with some other methods. One of those is model predictive control. So this is like a lot more popular in the recent years, which optimizes control actions over a future time horizon using a predictive model. So with model predictive control, there's usually an optimizer, something that really tries to minimize or maximize an objective here. And we generally see some pretty promising results with that. It does come at a high computational cost. So it would require each building, let's say, to develop or calibrate a model that is able to be effective in predicting a future horizon. So it can be resource consuming, and also maybe harder to scale across a neighborhood, for example, of 10 or 100 homes. And then another example or another methodology that we have is reinforcement learning. With reinforcement learning, the idea is that it can learn optimal control through trial and error and interacting directly with the environment. So it can handle nonlinear or complex dynamics, and it can be adaptable to changing conditions, things like weather or building energy loads. But this is like a purely black box approach, pretty much. So the decision-making process can be harder to interpret. And then there isn't really a guarantee that the optimal decision-making can be achieved. But that's sort of on a scale of 10 to 100 buildings, it could be more applicable for us in terms of this kind of control. So I'll give a little bit of background on reinforcement learning and what it is. So the whole idea hinges upon having an agent, and our agent controls an action or makes an action. So in this case, it could be, let's say, a battery itself, and the agent is deciding when to charge or discharge a battery. So let's say it charges the battery by half of the maximum charging power. Once that action is being done, the environment states, the S here, get updated. So what's going on in your environment, things like the state of charge of the battery, maybe weather variables, price variables that are important. And let's say the net electricity consumption of a house. Let's say that battery affects how much energy is being consumed at the household level. And then the agent understands or learns how well it's performed on this action based on a reward function that is set by the user. So the reward function could be maximizing local PV production, or it could be minimizing electricity costs. But at the end of the day, it's through making lots of actions and understanding, linking those actions with potential rewards, that the agent then understands which actions lead to better rewards or better achieves better the goals. So I'll give a brief introduction of CityLearn, which is a simulation environment for implementing control. Originally, it was made to implement reinforcement learning, though other algorithms and rule-based control can also be implemented. The way it's structured is that you have X number of buildings that you specify an input, and within each building, you have this control environment where you basically specify which loads are controllable and which ones are not controllable. So CityLearn was originally developed by Jose Vasquez Contele about 5 years ago now, 6 years. And it really started as looking at the control of cooling storage or heating storage, domestic hot water storage, and electrical storage. So leveraging storage as your key sources for energy flexibility and things like that. You don't need to worry about the occupant preferences or anything like that because you're just kind of controlling storage. A study by Giuseppe Pinto and Alfonso Capozoli's group in Politecnico Torino integrated heat pump control within CityLearn. So this really kind of opened the door for controlling more of the building energy systems. And that was introduced a couple of years back. And so the heat pump modeling, all of that was integrated within Giuseppe's work. And that's where I came in, where I saw that and I said, okay, that's great. But what if we add on another component to that, which is that we are controlling a heat pump and we are controlling our heating and cooling needs in the building, but we also allow an occupant to kind of say, to override the control and say, no, 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 I'm a little too cold or I'm a little too warm. What happens when we do that? How can we integrate that? So that's where this study really, really lies. Yeah, and just a little bit about our motivation. So when we look at previous studies, simulation focused more so, what we see is that most studies tend to overlook occupant diversity. So kind of assuming uniform set point preferences. We also find that most studies don't really consider the occupants overriding the thermostat in general during demand response events, for example. And finally, when studies do go into more details regarding set points or override behavior, it's generally on a single building scale and not on a neighborhood scale, and looking at those effects kind of together. So that's what we wanted to do with this work. I've including the learning objectives for clarity. So the idea here is that after this participation, I would hope that everyone would be able to apply data-driven approaches to characterize thermostat set point preferences and override behaviors using thermostat data. Also distinguishing between different levels of detail for occupant thermostat behavior modeling. And finally, how to go about implementing a multi-agent reinforcement learning-based control that balances comfort, occupant thermal comfort or needs with energy consumption goals. So I've divided my methodology into these two main research questions. I'll start with number one, which is just how can we model occupant thermostat override behavior? And then once we've done that, now how can we incorporate that into a control scheme for direct load control? So the first thing we did was look at the ecobee smart thermostat data. So this data it's more than 8 terabytes worth of thermostat data across 200 households across North America. In Quebec specifically, we were working with about 700 houses. And I was only looking at the heating season specifically for this study. Within this data set, you have a lot of different variables. I've included some of them here, like indoor air temperature, set point temperature, the hour, time of day, HVAC mode. You also have a column, a variable that indicates the program or event. So sometimes you'll see things like home, away. It could be a specific person's program, like Catherine. These are programmable by the user. And then within this column, there is an indicator for a hold. So what a hold represents is some time step where the occupant deviated from the set program itself. And we call a set point override as the first time step where a hold is initiated. And so what we did was a simple kind of like k-means clustering of looking at what the average indoor air temperature was during a set point override. And we came up with two main clusters. Once we did that, we plotted the average daily thermostat temperature for each of the two clusters. And that's what we can see here. So our average occupants had roughly 21 to 21.5 degrees Celsius, which is about 70 Fahrenheit. Which we called an average occupant just because this is what we would typically see from set point temperatures or expect here in Quebec. And then we have a second cluster that we called tolerant because it's roughly 19 to 20 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 67 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's just slightly lower temperature settings for this cluster. So once we have those, now we need to look at the override behavior itself. So why is thermostat override behavior so difficult to model? There are many, many reasons. I think 3 of the key ones are that firstly, overrides are very infrequent. So it's like less than 2% of your time steps where you have an override that occurs. So it's really highly unbalanced data. Secondly, occupancy data is very unreliable as well. At best, maybe a house that has an ecobee thermostat maybe has one occupancy sensor. But again, if the occupant is in a different room or if they're asleep, that's not really going to be triggered. And we know that knowing occupancy can help us know when overrides will occur. So that's kind of a difficulty, is just like not having that occupancy data. And then thirdly, poor thermostat usability. So as much improvements are trying to be made, thermostats are hard to use. And we can see in the data as well, we see sometimes where we know people are trying to just turn off the heating, for example, in their home. And so they increase the set point by something like 10 degrees Celsius. And it's not that they actually want the temperature to increase. It's just they're trying to get a system to do something that it's not doing. And unfortunately, all of that behavior that's seen as a bit odd makes its way into the data that we're working with. So this is just another thing that you have to tackle when you're looking at kind of modeling the override behavior itself. So to kind of overcome some of these difficulties, one of the key methods that we use for modeling the probability of an override is using univariate logistic regression curves. So this is from another study by Barak Gunai, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with, where it shows basically you have your data set and you're plotting what the probability of a set point increase would be in the next 15 minutes. So by looking at it on a time frame, you can see that, and you're fitting a logistic regression curve based on the probabilities that you have of a set point increase. And this is our formulation of that equation where you're solving for your A and B coefficients here. And it's really just fitting a probability curve based on the indoor air temperature. So we chose to use this methodology as well, but what we did was we adapted it for different times of day. And this is to kind of understand or take into account that we know that more overrides are occurring during the morning and evening periods when people tend to be at home. So what I did was look at the probability during these 3 periods, times of day separately. So what you can see in these curves here is that, for example, for the average occupants in the morning and evening times where we expect more overrides to occur, as the indoor air temperature goes down, roughly about 18 degrees maybe, you have about a 50% probability of a set point override within the next hour. And as that temperature goes down, that probability increases. For the midday and the nighttime periods, that probability is slightly lower. And again, this is just based off of the data that we had. And then finally, we did add a curve to demonstrate the probability of a set point decrease. We just did one curve for this because we're focusing on a winter heating scenario. So we hope that our indoor air temperature doesn't reach 25. Otherwise, something is going wrong with our control. But there is a curve there to decrease the set point in the event that that does happen. And that's what that curve there is for. And then finally, we did this for both the average and the tolerant occupants. And so what you can see here is for these 3 curves, like the average occupant, you're seeing the probability increase right around like 17 or 18 degrees. That starts increasing. Whereas for the tolerant occupants, the probability doesn't start increasing till a little bit lower, roughly 17 degrees Fahrenheit. So slightly different probabilities depending on which occupant type. So the second part of this is if there is an override, by how much is the set point changed? I would refer you to the paper to understand more about these models, but what we did was we trained a pretty simple machine learning model using random forests. It could be, we could have randomly sampled. This is all very modular. You could swap out this for something else. We decided to do it this way. We used a couple of input variables, the set point temperature an hour previously, and then the deviation between the set point and the indoor air 1 hour previous to tell us basically, is it a large or a small override to the set point? And that is what we integrated within the control. But again, this could have just been randomly sampled, but we chose to do it this way. So yeah, once we've modeled the override behavior, now the next part is how do we integrate this into the control? I'll give an overview on the application first. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to do automated heat pump control for 10 houses in Montreal. We simulated this in CityLearn, which I mentioned previously, using reinforcement learning-based agents. And our idea here with the reinforcement learning is that we have these 2 occupant types, the average and the tolerant. And with the reinforcement learning-based approach, like we want our agents to be able to learn the different behaviors of those 2 occupant types. So that's why we chose reinforcement learning. And then we look at 3 different occupant levels of detail. I'll talk about that in the next slide. And again, winter heating season, just from January 1 to March 31st. And what we did for our demand response was that we implemented thermostat set point reductions during specific demand response events. I'll detail those a little bit later as well. And then for our KPIs, so what we wanted to look at was our net electricity consumption during our demand response periods. We also look at electricity cost across the entire testing period. So the 3 months that we're looking at. We look at the number of overrides, the deviation between the set point and the indoor air temperature. And then we're also looking at ramping. So ramping is our time step to time step change in the electricity consumption across the entire neighborhood. And so we wanted to characterize that as well to see how the neighborhood level performance was working. So yeah, the occupant levels of detail. So this is really important because what we wanted to understand was how the overrides affect our overall performance. So our LOD1 is our scenario with no control of the heat pump at all and no demand response set points. And so this is our benchmark baseline LOD. Our LOD2, we have control of the heat pump itself, and then we have implemented setbacks, set point reductions for demand response, but we don't allow the occupant to override the set point. And then LOD3 is the same thing, except that we do allow for overrides in the case of LOD3. So what happens, what this looks like is that we have an RL agent, which I'll describe the RL environment and everything in more detail further on, but the agent decides for each house how much heat pump heating supply power to give at a certain time step. We have a thermodynamics model that tells us what our indoor air temperature is for the households as a result of that action. And then our set point gets updated accordingly for each hour that it happens. And again, in the case of LOD2, there's no override. But LOD3 really introduces these override models was based on the indoor air temperature. Is our occupant comfortable? Are they overriding the set point or not? If it is an increase or decrease, then we decide how much it is, if it's a large increase or a small increase. And then our set point gets updated, and then our agents make their actions accordingly. So that's the variation that we want to see for the study. And then, yeah, so this is our thermostat set point schedules. So to implement the demand response, we use reductions to the thermostat set point. So what we have here is our set point temperature. Okay, I can see my estimations in Fahrenheit were slightly off between the two. I was doing that kind of on the fly. But yeah, so you have here in Fahrenheit and Celsius what our set point profiles look like for our two clusters. This one being the average occupants and these ones being the tolerant occupants. And then what we have is we've selected very specific times where we're implementing a demand response event. So what we have is about 25 events between January 1st to March 31st, where we've selected either from 6 to 9 a.m. or 4 to 8 p.m. We've reduced that set point from its schedule by 2 degrees Fahrenheit or about 1.1 degrees Celsius. And we've actually specifically chosen the 25 events based on when the weather was like the most critical, the coldest, during the time period from January 1st to March 31st. So just those 25 events. And then this figure here shows our methodology kind of in a very modular way, what data we're using and what models, submodels we have built. We've used Energy Plus models to simulate our non-shiftable loads for the buildings, and as well as our scenario without the control of the heat pumps, but still to understand what the heating demands are for each building. I'm not going to talk too much about that. We have more details of it in the paper, but I'll briefly mention it in the next couple of slides. We also have building thermodynamics models. We use LSTMs to approximate our changes in indoor air temperature at each hourly time step. Once again, this is developed based on a methodology by Alfonso Capozoli's team in Italy. I'm not going to spend any time more talking about those, but we have a lot of details of that in both Giuseppe Pinto's paper as well as our paper as well. The occupant override models, which I've just described previously. So again, this kind of two-step part to the overrides of the probability and then the magnitude. And then finally, we have CityLearn, our control environment. So I will talk in more detail about how we implemented the reinforcement learning-based control. So a brief summary of our case study building. So we used the Restock building, the Restock data which gives us Open Studio models, which we then converted to Energy Plus models. And then we did some clustering just to have a lot of variation for each household that we considered. So as you can see, the year that it was built, the insulation rates, all of this is quite varied for each of the households. There are 10, I clipped it just for the sake of the visuals. Different EUIs, different window to wall ratios. And then for each household, we assigned whether or not it would have a tolerant or an average occupant. And that informed the set point settings that then we input into the Energy Plus models. Next, I'm going to talk about the reinforcement learning-based control that we implement in CityLearn. Yeah, so our agent action here, our agent goal is really to decide at each hour what proportion of the maximum heat pump heating supply power to provide. We have one agent controlling each individual house, so 10 agents for 10 houses. And in order to make that decision, they have the variables that you can see here in the observation space. So it'll have time, the day, the hour, the outdoor air temperature, the upcoming outdoor air temperature, electricity rates, upcoming electricity rates. This helps inform when a demand response event is coming, because we did use time of use pricing. So our off-peak periods have a set price, whereas the demand response periods do have a higher price. And then the net electricity consumption of the house at each hour, the indoor air temperature, and the set point temperature. The idea being here that if we had a building automation system for the household itself, these would be kind of variables that would be reasonable to have, let's say, access to, not something like the electricity consumption in 1 hour or 2 hours, for example. And then our agent learns the optimal actions based on this reward function that we've crafted. So what we have here in this curve is our set point. Again, this is just a theoretical curve here, not the actual one. But in the dashed lines, what we have is a band, a plus or minus 2 degrees Celsius band around the set point itself. And the star here shows our indoor air temperature. When the indoor air temperature is too far, more than 2 degrees below the set point, the agent is penalized, meaning it has a negative reward based on that deviation. When the indoor air temperature is less than 2 degrees below the set point temperature, this is our optimal scenario. We're looking in winter, so we want the indoor air temperature to be at or just slightly below the set point. And that reward is 0, which is our maximum reward that this agent can possibly get. So this staying in this zone is what our agent is trying to learn to achieve. And then finally, if the indoor air temperature is higher than the set point, this is not energy efficient behavior. And so we penalize the agent accordingly. And if it's very far high, it gets penalized even more by an exponent, by exponentially. So our main goal is for the agent to achieve what you can see here, which is the indoor air temperature at or just slightly below the set point. So I'll give some summary of the results. So firstly, I'm going to present these KPIs across the entire 3-month testing period, and they're all normalized by our baseline, which is LOD1. So what we can see here is our LOD2 with no overrides. You have about a 15% reduction in the electricity cost. LOD3, it's about a 12% reduction. Again, we use time of use pricing. So with that control, we do see a reduction in the electricity cost for the consumer. So there's some benefit for participation there. As expected, we see our net electricity consumption also decreased. Again, this is across the entire testing period. We'll look later at the specific demand response periods themselves, but we see about an 8% reduction for LOD3 and 11 for LOD2. Average daily peak, again, we see a little bit of a change between the two. And then for ramping, we do see an increase. So it's worth mentioning that for the LOD2 with no overrides, our ramping, which is again our time step to time step demand, net electricity consumption across the cluster, it was only a 5% increase, but with our control, it was a 17% increase. It's worth mentioning because ramping was not our primary KPI, but if that is, let's say, your key grid objective, the reward function could be tailored appropriately to, let's say, consider the indoor air temperature and the set point, as well as, let's say, minimize ramping as well. So I wanted to show, again, some of the KPIs, the net electricity consumption, just looking now at the periods of the 25 demand response events, because this is really the key goal of this is energy shifting, electricity shifting during those periods. So what we can see here is that it shows our net electricity consumption for all 10 houses during those periods. Our LOD1 is in black. And our LOD2 is in blue. Our LOD3 with overrides is in maroon. For LOD2, on average across the households, we get about a 22% reduction in net electricity consumption. So this is an improvement if you look at just 11% on average across the whole 3-month testing period. Now we're seeing 22% when we just zoom in on these DR periods. So that's quite significant. And then maybe even more promising, we do see still a 17% reduction with our LOD3 while still allowing the occupants to override. So all that to say, we can still give the control to the occupants. We can let them override, but we can still achieve some meaningful results with that. And then finally, we just wanted to show that the difference between LOD2 and LOD3 in the results was as low as 1% for some buildings. Like you can see here, they're pretty similar. But for building 2, for example, the difference between LOD2 and LOD3 was 34%. So sometimes our agent action is just not going to be as good in terms of performance for LOD3 and allowing for the overrides. Sometimes there is some compensation by the agent. For example, if there's multiple overrides, it's trying to then heat up the building a lot to compensate, and that also affects ramping. So this is just what happens when you're working with reinforcement learning or control in general or stochastic behavior from the occupants. So it's not unexpected that we do see some variation in the performance amongst the buildings themselves. They also have different demand profiles. So some actions or maybe easier to anticipate or make the decisions for than other buildings. And then finally, we wanted to show the load shaping curves before and after the control. So what we can see here in these 3 curves up top, the black one is our LOD1, our baseline during the days in which a demand response event occurred for LOD1 here. LOD2 is in blue just below it, where we can see substantial reductions, especially during these red periods. And likewise for LOD3, not quite as substantial. There are the overrides allowed, but when we look at the difference between LOD1 and LOD3, it's still quite substantial. The reason that the days with demand response have a much higher net electricity consumption is because we specifically implemented the demand response on the coldest days that we had during that 3-month period. So that's why our average electricity consumption is higher during those days. And we can see the resulting reductions that we had after the control. And again, now below in the dashed, it represents our days without demand response. So again, these are the less critical weather days. So that's why these curves are slightly lower. And we see our LOD1 in black here. And we do see slight reductions in electricity consumption, even on the days without our demand response events. And this is because of our reward function. So we're kind of telling the agent to keep our indoor air temperature slightly below the set point, and that's resulting in some slight reductions even outside of those demand response days. But again, less so for the LOD3, where you still have overrides that can occur. And then lastly, we wanted to characterize how much our set point deviations were. So we called the unmet set point hours the time periods where the indoor air temperature deviated from the set point by more than 2 degrees Celsius. And we found that for LOD2, it was very, very small. So 99% of our time steps, the deviation was less than 2 degrees. And then for our LOD3 with the overrides, it was still great. Like more than 95% of our time steps had a deviation less than 2 degrees. But not quite as good as LOD2, which is as expected. So what this graph shows, it's a temperature graph. So it shows the number of occurrences for each building where the deviation occurred within these ranges. So the darker colors really concentrated from 0 to 1 here, -1, show that the agent was really able for LOD2 to keep the indoor air temperature just below the set point, which is or within a half a degree of the set point, basically, which is exactly what we wanted our agent to achieve. LOD3, we still got great results, but we can see that it's spread out a little bit more. When you allow for the overrides, that means that the set point can change by 1.5 degrees in one time step. So it does take the time to achieve that new set point again. So we see it a little bit more spread out. But ultimately, the darkest colors are concentrated around where we want them, which is indicating that our set point is just at or below the, or our indoor air temperature is at or just below the set point, excuse me. And then finally, I wanted to show the number of overrides during our training phase for the agents to really show the agent learning process and how it's able to understand the optimal decision making. So what I have here is the number of overrides that occurred during our training episodes. So we have 10 training episodes, which are shown here. Each one is about 6 months of training data. And this is not the same data that it was tested on that we used, of course. But we did was we cycled through this training data 10 times so that our agent could continue making decisions and learning from the overrides what decisions to make. So what you see here is the darker colors represent the bigger overrides. And you can see that regardless of if it's a tolerant occupant or an average occupant, it starts off in the first episode with a lot of overrides during those training the training time, and then by the 10th episode the number of overrides goes down quite significantly, and also the magnitude of the overrides. So by the end you have far fewer amounts of the large overrides, and that just shows our agent kind of being able to learn the optimal decision making. So our key findings. So even while allowing for the overrides in LOD3, we did achieve significant electricity savings. So this is very promising for both of our two occupant types. On average, our LOD2 could overestimate savings in net electricity consumption, cost, and peak demand by about 5% compared to LOD3. So again, allowing that override flexibility, we do expect that the savings are not as much as when you don't allow for overrides. And it was about a 5% difference across the whole 3-month testing period. And then finally, as I mentioned, the ramping was increased by LOD3, but future work could, again, incorporate this maybe into the reward function in a different way, depending on what your grid objectives are. Limitations. So we use a lot of submodels here. Again, the occupant override models come with their own assumptions and errors. Our building thermodynamics models, the LSTMs themselves, have their own assumptions and errors. So we're coupling a lot of these together. If we were to implement this in a real life application, we would expect that we would get completely different results. You know, it's not going to translate to exactly a 17% reduction in electricity savings, but it is intended for scenario modeling. So like, what if the override rates increase by a little bit more? What if, how do we structure our algorithm or even the decentralized reinforcement learning approach to handle these kinds of different behavior? That's what we're trying to achieve with this. And then, as I mentioned, because of the structure of the reward function, so this application requires that the occupants change their schedules manually in the event that their preferences change, rather than the agent learning their new set point preferences. So this is something that future work, like I think we would like to incorporate or change, let's say, is right now it's focused around having a set point schedule, but then the agent is trying to match with the indoor air temperature. But it would be really cool and optimal, I guess, if your agent were able to just implicitly learn which set point to make the schedule based on your occupant and their interactions with the thermostat. So that's a great area for future work. And then to summarize, so our main research contribution here, at least at the time that we were doing this, we believe it was the first study that incorporated a data-driven occupant thermostat override model into an HVAC control. We did this using a multi-agent reinforcement learning approach that was capable of handling multiple occupant types. We considered unique household thermostat preferences, and we showed that we were able to learn optimal decision-making across different override behaviors. This is where it gets more interesting. So the implication here for stakeholders, the point of doing this and really setting up this kind of control is so that the grid operators, they can understand how to tailor demand response programs accordingly and really harness as much flexibility potential as possible. So what kinds of prices, how do prices affect this as well, is a very interesting question. For policymakers, understanding smart thermostat deployment, like understanding the value of it, understanding what they can provide in terms of flexibility. And finally, the consumer, there's definitely potential cost savings without necessarily compromising thermal comfort. And that's what we've been trying to demonstrate. And so for future work and applications, there's so many different ideas that we have. I'm wrapping up my PhD, so my goal here is to inspire, and I hope that someone else will take on some of these. So one is integrating more reliable occupancy data to really exploit the away period. So we did not consider, giving our agent the information of yes, the building is occupied or not. We didn't have a very good way of knowing when it was occupied or not. Maybe better occupancy data could incorporate this further, and you could definitely get a lot more energy flexibility with that. Secondly, as I mentioned, analyzing different reward functions to say satisfy alternative grid objectives. There's a lot of potential there. How does demand response flexibility potential vary regionally is a super interesting question. So here in Montreal, these were our 2 clusters for here in Quebec. We didn't really look at a case for if we had a sensitive occupant, but I think this is a very important question. And then lastly, I just wanted to point out that the set points here in this red box generally fall below what ASHRAE 55 recommendations would qualify for like thermal comfort. So this is outside of the thermal comfort range. There are several reasons why this could be the case. One being that we are in a cold climate. So ASHRAE 55 is like a general recommendation across North America, but we're in a cold climate. It could be just that people are more used to colder temperatures here in Quebec. There's also energy poverty that could be related to this, like having colder set point temperatures to reduce energy costs. And all of this just to say that reasons why we should be looking more at thermostat preferences and behaviors more thoroughly for each region. And then finally, I just want to shout out Kingsley's work here. If anyone's interested in pursuing this a little bit further, his paper here, which was, I think, presented at ibpsa in 2023, talks about how to completely replicate this entire study. So the framework for the design of representative neighborhoods in CityLearn across 3 regions in the US. So we did Vermont, California, and Texas. I've shown here, we did the clustering using the ecobee data set for Vermont and Texas. For Vermont, it was a heating scenario. In Texas, it was a cooling scenario. And then the Restock data set from NREL has, more than 500,000 open studio models. So really to like replicate this whole portion of the study, Kingsley did a great job outlining that for anyone else to take a look at. And then finally, this is the full paper. Like, as I mentioned, there's a couple of submodels here. The paper goes into way more detail about that. So Giacomo and Alfonso's team really did so much of the work on the building thermodynamics models, which I've referenced and haven't really talked too much about. But they're all detailed in there, as well as Giuseppe's paper, which developed that methodology. Kingsley and Zoltan led all of the development of the CityLearn platform itself to really incorporate this and make sure that it's usable for people. So that can't thank them enough for that work as well. And then my co-supervisors, which helped with the methodology of everything and communicating our results and whatnot. So I want to stress that our code is modular and open source. So the idea being here that, let's say you don't want to use an LSTM model and you have RC models that you want to use, great. If you have other Energy Plus models, it's intended to be replicated using other models, using other buildings. And it is open source, and you can find everything on the CityLearn GitHub here. I've linked, Kingsley has a paper talking about the latest version of CityLearn and its capabilities, because beyond the overrides and heat pump control, there's other controllable loads within CityLearn, and he kind of dictates in this paper the most recent updates. Thiago Fonseca's work integrated EVs within CityLearn, which is super cool, and their team is actually leading some more recent developments with CityLearn, and they're publishing the latest version of it later this week on PyPy. So like the latest version of CityLearn will come out later this week, I think, from Thiago's team. So I just wanted to link them there. And then, you can access the GitHub here, and I'd be happy to take any questions that anyone has.
Thank you, Catherine. This was great,
Thank
amazing presentation. As we pointed out in the
can't see
beginning,
anyone.
yes,
Okay.
so
There we go. Thanks.
Kingsley is here too, so shout out to
Oh, well,
Kingsley.
there we go.
Yeah.
Then he heard my shout
Yeah.
out. Kingsley deserves all of the praise, all of the
For the
continued
CityLearn, yeah.
all of the continued updates. Kingsley finished his PhD last year and still helps us with continued CityLearn updates. So shout out. He deserves a lot of thanks for this work as well.
So we have one comment from Robert Bean, and I don't know if any of you in the participants for this webinar would like to raise their voice.
Oh, wait,
and
hold
then
on. Aisha,
take it. Go ahead.
I need to make sure that people, oh, wait, allow participants to unmute themselves. Okay, yeah, I just made the change.
Okay,
Okay,
perfect.
we're
So
good.
you guys are welcome to like unmute yourselves, and it would be better if you raise your hand so we allow you to like be like saying your name out loud. Would you like me to read Robert's comment, or you want to take it in the chat?
I can, maybe read it out and then try to answer it.
Yeah, that would be cool. Thank you.
Okay. So Robert Bean has said if air temperature is being used as a proxy for thermal comfort, it would conflict with ASHRAE 55 standards. For human occupancy, where comfort may also include, yes, a bunch of other things. Air velocity plus if the occupants are at a low metabolic rate and clothing, then asymmetry, stratification, floor temps, and drafts must be considered in compliance. Yes. Going back to the study without resolving for the other metrics in standard 55, the air temperature target results don't reflect what the occupants might actually be experiencing. Yes, so this is all very true. We weren't so much trying, thermal comfort in this study specifically. I guess I should stress that there's no real way to know if people are going to be comfortable or not. So I guess we can't say that even at the indoor air temperature that they would be comfortable or not. What we're trying to give is, I guess, the flexibility of control. So with our LOD2 and LOD3, allowing for the occupant to still have the control of changing the set point of the thermostat is our way of like helping the occupant retain the ability to change the thermostat accordingly. But no, you're completely correct that just knowing the indoor air temperature and doing this, we can't just say that they're comfortable because it's at 21 degrees or at 20 degrees. So you're completely right. Just including that there's many other parameters there, not just the indoor air temperature. I included it just to kind of show that they were quite low thermostat set point temperatures, lower than, let's say, if you were looking at those types of standards for set points that you were going to include in an Energy Plus model, or even looking at the baseline set points that, let's say, Energy Plus gives as the default settings. They're quite lower than that. But you're totally right. We can't say that they are actually comfortable at those ranges or not with the control. So I hope that answers the question. And if you want to talk more or unmute yourself, you can.
If Robert is not
Okay.
going to take this, he said thank you. So
Okay.
Levi has another question. Levi, go ahead and
Okay.
unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I missed the beginning part, but my question mainly resides around how much you trust the heat pump models behind this. You're doing some winter testing, and there is going to be defrost cycles that occur. Does CityLearn account for cycling? It seemed like you have a modulation in the reinforcement, where you can control the heat input from 0 to 100, but in reality, that's a very discretized control action that you actually have in the field. And I was just looking for some clarification on that.
Yeah, so for much more detail on that, there was a whole study that went through the heat pump control and how to model that specifically, which was led by Alfonso Cabilzoli's team. So first and foremost, I will say I can point you to the resources that go through the testing of that, the modeling and the testing of that. But it is a basic like COP based model. So based on the outdoor air temperature, what the efficiencies are with the heat pump, and it's a quite simplified model. But it was developed for them, intended for this kind of methodology. And it does take into consider the outdoor air temperature during the operations. But beyond that, not looking like long-term cycling through that, maybe the effects of that. And also I should say a lot of these things are able to be tailored within the modeling. For example, like if you want to change the COPs or things like that for the heat pumps, that's all customizable within CityLearn. And so as new information comes out about how to better model the heat pumps, that can also be improved within CityLearn itself.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Livy. Do we have any questions from the audience? And this was a great conversation. I mean, like even like pointing out like heat pump and then knowing that ASHRAE standards are in discussion in the research like area, right? Like we all know that is does it really reflect the diversity of like people how they're feeling and then how it can be like integrated and same with the heat pumps. Like now we're having extreme events, extreme cold events. Like so what's gonna happen to that? Like is CityLearn will is it going to like improve to implement that so that is
Mhm.
quite good. And Tom is saying that winter defrost mode, did you see problems with condensate runoff such as ice or mold buildup near the home? We have this problem within our unit near Sacramento and have tried delaying the startup time in the morning.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I should say this is all in simulation. It's not done or just reinforce that this was all done in simulation. So things like considerations like this would need to be done or for future work and especially if this were, yeah, continued modeling. We did not consider this at all for our study. I should stress like what we're really focusing on is the occupant behavior, like how it goes, how we would implement the like setbacks and allow for the overrides of the thermostat. But looking more into yeah, the defrost mode, things like this for the heat pumps is a really good suggestion. And we can definitely do some more work for that.
That
But yeah,
sounds
this
like a
is
new
simulation, so we did not
Yeah, that
consider
sounds like a
things.
new great dissertation idea, like to
Yeah.
consider
For
like agent.
for
Well, not for
yes,
you. You'll soon to
please.
be graduating, but somebody else to take over.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Tom. If we don't have any other questions, I mean, I want to thank Catherine first for being here and presenting. And then remind you guys this will be shared on YouTube, but I wanted to provide these QR codes for you if to sign up if you're interested. We have our research group. The presentation is I mean, this webinar is presented by ibpsa-usa Research Group Committee. And if you want to sign up, we have the QR code, but you could easily find us by writing down like ibpsa-usa Research Committee on ibpsa's website. We have following event, which I will advertise now, like in a minute, but events will be also shown on our website. And then please follow us on YouTube so that you could get access to these recordings. And I forgot to remind you this, if you need a AIA credit, let us know if somehow it's not applied to your ID. And yes, thank you for sharing your email, Catherine. And our next month's webinar will be on November 20th. And it's about building grid interaction signals and transformer aging at cluster level. Will be presented by Tuchin Krant Mitic. And we would love to see you there. Please, again, follow us on ibpsa LinkedIn page and YouTube page, USA. So you are aware of every webinar is happening hosted by us. Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks, Aisha. And I just want to say I put my email in the chat. And for those of you with questions, or if you want to know more like specifically about the heat pump modeling, I can just shoot me an email because I can send you to those resources and even the code itself where you can look exactly, it's all open source as I mentioned, exactly how the heat pump is modeled and also which parameters you can specify yourself and change and try to, yeah, analyze that further. So yeah. Just reach out to me and I'm happy also to provide Kingsley's paper, on the neighborhood design, how you could go about replicating this. So yeah, feel free to reach out
Okay.
anytime.
Thank you. Oh,
Thank you, everyone. Thanks,
have a
Aisha,
nice
for
day. Yeah,
organizing.
yeah. Anytime. See you. Bye.
See you.